The study of learning has been at the core of the field of psychology. Although philosophers since the time of Aristotle have speculated on the foundations of learning, the first systematic research on learning was done at the beginning of the 20th century when Ivan Pavlov developed the framework for learning called classical conditioning. So, Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian psychologist, never intended to do psychological research. In fact, in 1904, he won the Nobel Prize for his work on digestion. Yet, Pavlov is remembered not for his physiological research, but for his experiments on basic learning processes, work that began quite accidentally. Pavlov had been studying the secretion of stomach acids and salivation. While doing that, he observed a curious phenomenon. Sometimes stomach secretions and salivation would begin in the dogs when they had not even eaten yet. The mere sight of the experimenter who normally brought the food, or even the sound of the experimenter's footsteps, was enough to produce salivation in the dogs. He saw that the dogs were responding not only on the basis of the biological need, which is hunger, but also as a result of learning, or as it came to be called, classical conditioning. So, a dog does not learn to salivate in response to food in its mouth. Rather, food in the mouth automatically, unconditionally triggers the dog's salivation reflex. Thus, Pavlov called this drooling an unconditioned response, and he called the food an unconditioned stimulus. Salivation in response to a tone, however, is learned. It is conditional upon the dogs associating the tone with the food. Thus, we call this response the conditioned response. Although the terminology Pavlov used to describe classical conditioning may seem confusing, the following summary can help make the relationship between stimuli and responses easier to understand and remember. So just remember, conditioned equals learned. Unconditioned equals unlearned. The unconditioned stimulus leads to an unconditioned response. Unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response parents are not learned and not trained. They are naturally occurring. During conditioning, a previously neutral stimulus is transformed into the conditioned stimulus. A conditioned stimulus leads to a conditioned response, and a conditioned stimulus conditioned response pairing is a consequence of learning and training. An unconditioned response and a conditioned response are similar, such as salivation in Pavlov's experiment, but the unconditioned response occurs naturally, whereas the conditioned response is learned. So, just to recap on this section, what is learning? Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior resulting from experience. And how do we learn to form associations between stimuli and responses? One major form of learning is classical conditioning, which occurs when a natural stimulus, one that normally brings about no relevant response, is repeatedly paired with a stimulus, which is called an unconditioned response, that brings about a natural, untrained response. Now, Conditioning occurs when the neutral stimulus is repeatedly presented just before the unconditioned stimulus. After repeated pairings, the neutral stimulus elicits the same response that the unconditioned stimulus brings about. When this occurs, the neutral stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus, and the response is a conditioned response. Learning is not always permanent. Extinction occurs when a previously learned response decreases in frequency and eventually disappears. Stimulus generalization is the tendency for a conditioned response to follow a stimulus that is similar to, but not the same as, the original conditioned stimulus. The converse phenomena, stimulus discrimination, occurs when an organism learns to distinguish between stimuli.